Kafa, The Metamorphosis Part 10. He could not remember hearing his sister play since the arrival of the lodgers, but this evening the sound of the violin came from the kitchen. The lodgers had just finished their meal. The middle one had brought a newspaper, and had given a page to each of the others. Now they all three read, leaning back in their chairs and smoking. The sound of the violin attracted their attention, and they rose and walked on tiptoe toward the hall door, where they halted and remained very close together. Apparently they had been heard in the kitchen, for the father cried, "Does the violin upset you, gentlemen? We'll stop it immediately." "On the contrary," said the man in the middle. "Would Fraulein Samson not like to come in and play to us here in the dining room, where it is much nicer and more comfortable?" "Oh, thank you," said the father, as if he were the violinist. The gentleman walked back across the room and waited. Soon the father came in with the music stand, the mother with the sheets of music, and the sister with the violin. The sister calmly prepared to play. Her parents, who had never before let their rooms, were exaggeratedly polite to the boarders and were afraid to seem presumptuous by sitting in their own chairs. The father leaned against the door, his right hand thrust between two buttons of his livery coat, but one of the gentlemen offered the mother a chair, in which she finally sat, not daring to move from her corner throughout the performance. The girl now began to play, while her father and mother, from either side, watched the movement of her hands. Attracted by the music, Gregor had crawled forward a little and had thrust his head into the room. He was no longer astonished that nowadays he had entirely lost that consideration for others, that anxiety to cause no trouble that once had been his pride. Yet never had he more reason to remain hidden, for now, because of the dirt that lay about his room, flying up at the slightest movement, he was always covered with dust and fluff, with ends of cotton and hairs, and with morsels of stale food, which stuck to his back or to his feet, and which he trailed after him wherever he went. His apathy had grown too great for him to bother any more about cleaning himself several times a day by lying on his back and rubbing himself on the carpet, as once he used to do. And this filthy state did not prevent him from crawling over the spotless floor without a moment's shame. So far, no one had noticed him. The family was too absorbed by the music of the violin, and the lodgers, who had first stood with their hands in their pockets, very close to the music stand, which disturbed the sister a great deal, as she was obliged to see their image dancing amid the notes, had at last retired toward the window, where they stood speaking together half aloud, with lowered heads, under the anxious gaze of the father, who was watching attentively. It had become only too evident that they had been deceived in their hopes of hearing some beautiful violin piece, or at least some amusing little tune. It seemed that what the girl was playing bored them, and that now they only tolerated her out of politeness. By the way in which they puffed the smoke of their cigars, by the energy with which they blew it toward the ceiling through the mouth or the nose, one could guess how fidgety they were becoming. And the sister was playing so nicely. Her face leaning to one side, her glance followed the score carefully and sadly. Gregor crawled forward a little more, and put his head as near as possible to the floor to meet her gaze. Could it be that he was only an animal, when music moved him so? It seemed to him to open a way toward that unknown nourishment he so longed for. He resolved to creep up to his sister and to pull at her dress to make her understand that she must come with him, for no one here would appreciate her music as much as he. He would never let her out of his room, at least, while he lived. For once, his horrible shape would serve him some useful purpose. He would be at all doors at once, repulsing intruders with his raucous breath, but his sister would not be forced to stay there. She must live with him of her own accord. She would sit by him on the sofa, hearing what he had to say. Then he would tell her in confidence that he had firmly intended to send her to the conservatory and had planned to let everyone know last Christmas, was Christmas really past, without listening to any objections. Had his misfortune not overtaken him too soon? His sister, moved by this explanation, would surely burst into tears, and Gregor, climbing up on her shoulder, would kiss her neck. This would be all the easier, for she had worn neither collar nor ribbon ever since she had been working in the shop. "Herr Samsa," cried the middle lodger, and he pointed at Gregor, who slowly came into the room. The violin was suddenly silenced. The middle lodger turned to his friends, grinning and shaking his head. Then once more he stared at Gregor. The father seemed to consider it more urgent to reassure the lodgers than to drive his son from the room, though the lodgers did not seem to be at all upset by the spectacle. In fact, Gregor seemed to amuse them more highly than did the violin. The father hurried forward and, with outstretched arms, tried to drive them into their room, hiding Gregor from them with his body. Now they began to be really upset, but it is not known whether this was on account of the father's action, or because they had been living with such a monstrous neighbor as Gregor without being made aware of it. They demanded explanations, waving their arms in the air, and fidgeting nervously with their beards. They retreated toward their own door. Meanwhile, the sister had recovered from the distress that the sudden interruption of her music had caused her. After remaining a moment completely at a loss, with the violin and the bow hanging from her helpless hands, following the score with her eyes, as if she were still playing, she suddenly came back to life, laid the violin in her mother's lap. The mother sat suffocating in her chair, her lungs working violently, and rushed into the next room, toward which the lodgers were rapidly retreating before Herr Samsa's onslaught. One could see how quickly, under Greta's practiced hand, pillows and covers were set in order on the beds. The lodgers had not yet reached the room when their beds were already prepared, and Greta had slipped out. The father seemed so possessed by his strange fury that he had quite forgotten the respect due to lodgers. He drove them to the door of the room, where the middle lodger suddenly came to a stop, stamping thunderously on the floor. "I wish to inform you," said this man, raising his hand and looking around for the two women, "that in view of the disgusting circumstances which govern this family and this house," and here he spat quickly on the carpet, "I hereby immediately give up my room. Naturally, you will not get a penny for the time I have been living here. On the contrary, I am considering whether I should not claim compensation from you, damages which should easily be awarded in any court of law. It is a matter about which I shall inquire, believe me." He was silent and stared into space, as if awaiting something. Accordingly, his two friends also spoke up. "We, too, give our notice." Thereupon the gentleman in the middle seized the door handle, and they went inside. The door closed with a crash. The father stumbled toward his chair, put his trembling hands upon the arms, and let himself drop into it. He looked exactly as if he were settling himself for his customary evening nap, but the way his head drooped heavily from side to side showed that he was thinking of something other than sleep. All this time Gregor had stayed still on the spot where he had surprised the lodgers. He felt completely paralyzed with bewilderment at the checking of his plans, perhaps, also, with weakness due to his prolonged fasting. He feared that the whole household would fall upon him immediately. He foresaw the precise moment when this catastrophe would happen, and now he waited. Even the violin did not frighten him as it fell with a clatter from the trembling fingers of his mother, who until now had held it in her lap. "My dear parents," said his sister, who beat with her hand on the table by way of introduction. "Things cannot go on like this. Even if you do not realize it, I can see it quite clearly. I will not mention my brother's name when I speak of this monster here. I merely want to say, we must find some means of getting rid of it. We have done all that is humanly possible to care for it, to put up with it. I believe that nobody could reproach us in the least." "She's 1,000 times right," said the father. But the mother, who had not yet recovered her breath, coughed helplessly behind her hand, her eyes haggard. The sister hurried toward her mother and held her forehead. Greta's words seemed to have made up the father's mind, for now he sat up in his armchair, and fidgeted with his cap among the dishes on the table, from which the lodger's meal had not yet been cleared. From time to time he stared at Gregor. "We must find a way of getting rid of it," repeated the sister, now speaking only to her father, for her mother, shaken by her coughing, could hear nothing. "It will bring you both to the grave. I can see it coming. When people have to work all day, as we must, we cannot bear this eternal torture each time we come home at night. I can stand it no longer." And she wept so bitterly that her tears fell on her mother's face, who wiped them off with a mechanical movement of her hand. "But what can we do, child?" said the father in a pitiful voice. It was surprising to see how well he understood his daughter. The sister merely shrugged her shoulders as a sign of the perplexity which, during her tears, had replaced her former assurance.